It was an ordinary Friday night in Alcácer, a quiet town near Valencia, Spain. Three teenagers, Miriam Garcia, 14 years old, Tony Gomez, 14 years old, and Desiree Hernandez, 15 years old, were getting ready to go out to a local disco called Cooler. The three were best friends, inseparable since childhood. They had grown up together on the same streets, had shared secrets and dreams, had planned their futures together. That night, they just wanted to dance, laugh, be teenagers enjoying a Friday night. Around 7:30 p.m., the girls left their homes. Miriam wore a denim jacket and jeans. Tony wore a pink sweater. Desiree wore her favorite clothes, feeling older, feeling free. Their parents told them to be home by midnight. Be careful, they said, as all parents do. They never imagined those would be the last words they'd say to their daughters. The girls began hitchhiking on the road connecting Alcácer with Picassent, where the disco was located. It was a common practice in rural Spain of the 1990s. Small towns were safe. People knew each other. Kids hitchhiked all the time. But that night, someone stopped. Someone who shouldn't have been on that road. Someone with intentions the girls could never have imagined. Miriam, Tony, and Desiree got into that car and disappeared into the darkness. When they didn't return home by midnight, their parents began to worry. By 1 a.m., they were frantic. By 2 a.m., they had called the police. And by sunrise, all of Alcácer knew that the three girls had disappeared. What no one knew, what no one would discover for 75 agonizing days, was that the girls were dead. They had been tortured, raped, and murdered within hours of getting into that car. And their bodies lay buried in an abandoned well just 60 kilometers away. But the story of the Alcácer girls isn't just about their murder. It's about what came after, the media circus, the conspiracy theories, the accusations of cover-up, and the questions that remain unanswered more than 3 decades later. I have to pause here because this story weighs on me. I've researched true crime cases for years, but this one is different. Not just because of the brutality, but because of how it became a spectacle, how the suffering of these girls and their families was exploited in ways that changed Spanish journalism forever. Where are you right now? Are you at home in Guadalajara, lying in bed in Barcelona, or perhaps driving through the streets of Santiago? Wherever you are, thank you for being here to listen to this story. Leave me your location in the comments. It reminds me that we're not alone in this, that we're a community trying to understand, to remember, to honor those who lost everything. If this is your first time here, you should know that this channel exists for one reason: to tell true crime stories with dignity and respect. Victims are not entertainment. They are real people whose lives mattered. If that approach resonates with you, please subscribe and turn on notifications. And if you're already part of this family, thank you. Your comment, sharing this video with someone who understands why these stories need to be told with respect. All of that keeps this work alive. Now, I have to warn you. This case involves sexual violence and torture of minors. I'll be as respectful as I can, but the facts are disturbing. If you need to pause, do so. Your mental health matters. These stories are important, but taking care of yourself is too. Let's return to Spain, November 1992. Because while the families of Miriam, Tony, and Desiree begged for information, police were about to make mistakes that would haunt this case for decades. The morning after the girls disappeared, Alcácer transformed. The town of approximately 7,000 people mobilized in a massive search. Hundreds of volunteers combed the surrounding fields, calling the girls' names, praying to find them alive. Fernando Garcia Fernandez, Miriam's father, stood before television cameras, his face a mask of anguish. "Please," he begged. "If anyone knows anything at all, help us bring our girls home." His voice broke. His hands trembled. You could see in his eyes that he already knew on some deep, instinctive level that something terrible had happened. The Guardia Civil, Spain's national police, established a task force. But from the beginning, there were problems. The investigation was chaotic, disorganized. Different police agencies worked on the same leads without coordination. Evidence was contaminated. Witnesses were interviewed multiple times by different officers, their statements becoming contradictory as details blurred. And critically, the first days, when leads are freshest, when witnesses remember most clearly, were wasted following false leads. Someone reported seeing the girls at a bus station. Police spent days investigating, only to discover it was a case of mistaken identity. Another witness claimed to have seen them get into a white car. Then another said it was a dark car. A third insisted it was a van. Police chased all these leads simultaneously, diluting their resources. Meanwhile, in an abandoned well called La Romana, 60 kilometers away, the bodies of Miriam, Tony, and Desiree lay buried beneath dirt and rubble. They had been tortured for hours. They had been raped repeatedly. They had been murdered and disposed of like garbage. And their killers were free, watching the media circus, knowing they had gotten away with it. What happened next in Spanish media was unprecedented and, for many, unforgivable. The case of the Alcácer girls became the biggest media event in Spanish history up to that point. Every television channel, every newspaper, every radio station covered the story nonstop. But it wasn't just news coverage. It became entertainment. Television programs held daily specials about the case. They brought in psychics who claimed to know where the girls were. They brought in self-proclaimed criminologists who speculated endlessly about what might have happened to them. They brought in the families and interviewed them over and over, capturing every tear, every moment of anguish, broadcasting it to millions. One program, hosted by a journalist named Nieves Herrero, became particularly notorious. Every night, millions of Spaniards tuned in to watch the latest updates, the latest theories, the latest heartbreaking emotions from the families. Psychics appeared on national television, claiming visions of where the girls were. "I can see them," they'd say, closing their eyes dramatically. "They're in an old building," or "they're near water," or "I can feel they're still alive." The families, desperate for any hope, believed these people. They organized searches based on psychic visions. They spent their meager resources chasing leads that didn't exist. And the police, instead of controlling the situation, instead of protecting the integrity of their investigation, allowed all of this to happen. In some cases, they even encouraged it, sharing investigation details with reporters, allowing cameras to film crime scenes. It was a spectacle, a horror turned into entertainment, and it set a precedent for crime journalism in Spain that still resonates today. January 27, 1993. It had been 75 days since the girls disappeared. 75 days of searches, of fading hopes, of families clinging to the possibility that their daughters might still be alive. Then, a beekeeper named Ramon Garcia, looking for a place for his hives, noticed something strange near an abandoned well in La Romana. There were signs of recent digging. The earth had been disturbed, then poorly covered. He called the Guardia Civil. And when officers began to dig, they found what all of Spain had been dreading: the bodies of Miriam Garcia, Tony Gomez, and Desiree Hernandez. The girls had been buried in shallow graves inside the abandoned well. They had been left naked, their clothes removed, their bodies showing signs of terrible abuse. The autopsy would reveal horrors that no parent should have to hear. The girls had been subjected to brutal sexual violence. They had been tortured, burned with cigarettes, beaten, mutilated. The suffering they endured in their final hours was unimaginable. The cause of death was asphyxiation. The killers had strangled them, one by one, and left them to die in that dark, abandoned well. But here's what enraged Spain. The autopsy showed that the girls had died within the first 24 hours of their disappearance. While the entire nation searched for them, while psychics claimed they were alive somewhere, while families clung to hope, the girls were already dead, buried in that well. 75 days of searching, 75 days of false hope, 75 days of media circus. And all the while, the girls were dead, their bodies just 60 kilometers from home. The Guardia Civil acted quickly after the bodies were found. They had leads, witness testimonies, forensic evidence from the disposal site, behavioral patterns that pointed to a certain type of criminal. On January 28th, 1993, just one day after the bodies were found, they arrested two men, Antonio Angles Martins and Miguel Riquet Tarrega. Angles, 27 years old, had a criminal history that should have raised immediate alarms. He had been arrested for rape, robbery, assault. He was known in his hometown of Cattarauja as violent, unpredictable, dangerous. Riquet, 32 years old, was Angles' brother-in-law. He was less violent than Angles but had his own criminal history of petty theft and assault. Police were also looking for a third man, Angles' brother Enrique Angles, but he provided an alibi that was accepted. The investigation focused on Antonio Angles and Miguel Riquet. Miguel Riquet confessed almost immediately. He described in graphic detail how he and Angles had picked up the girls hitchhiking. They had taken them to the abandoned well. They had tortured and raped them for hours. They had murdered them and buried them. Riquet's confession was detailed, specific, and absolutely horrific. He described who did what. He described how the girls had begged for their lives. He described the final moments of each girl. It was compelling evidence. Too compelling, some would later argue, because there were aspects of Riquet's confession that didn't add up, details that contradicted forensic evidence, claims that seemed designed to minimize his own role while maximizing Angles. But police had their confession. They had their man. Or at least they had one of them, because Antonio Angles had disappeared. This is where the case becomes even more controversial. Antonio Angles, the alleged mastermind behind the murders, the more violent of the two, managed to evade capture for days after the bodies were found. Police knew they were looking for him. They knew he was dangerous, yet somehow he managed to remain hidden, moving through Spain undetected. On January 29, 1993, 2 days after the bodies were found, Angles appeared at the port of Valencia. He boarded a cargo ship called the City of Plymouth, which was headed to Dublin, Ireland. How did he manage to board the ship without being detected? The port should have been under surveillance. His photograph had been distributed to all law enforcement. Yet somehow he got onto that ship. The official explanation is that he stowed away in a cargo container. But many questioned how a fugitive could navigate a secure port, find the right ship, and hide himself without help. Once aboard, Angles allegedly hid during the 4-day voyage to Dublin. When the ship arrived in Ireland on February 1, 1993, he's believed to have escaped. And then, he disappeared completely, despite a massive search by Interpol. Despite reported sightings in Ireland, Portugal, Italy, Brazil, and dozens of other countries, Antonio Angles was never found. Officially, he was declared dead in 2013, 20 years after the murders, based on the assumption that he had died while on the ship or shortly after reaching Ireland. But many don't believe this. Many believe Angles received help from family, from unknown accomplices, perhaps even from people within law enforcement. They believe he's alive somewhere, living under a false identity, having escaped justice for one of the most notorious crimes in Spanish history. Miguel Riquet's trial began in September 1997, more than 4 years after the murders. It was one of the most publicized trials in Spanish history, with constant media coverage and public protests outside the courthouse. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case. They had Riquet's confession. They had forensic evidence linking him to the disposal site. They had witness testimony placing him in the area the day the girls disappeared. Riquet's defense argued that he had been coerced by Antonio Angles, that he was too afraid to disobey, that his participation was minimal. They portrayed Riquet as a victim of Angles too, a weak man controlled by a more powerful monster. But the evidence told a different story. Forensic testimony suggested Riquet had actively participated in the tortures and murders. The details in his confession, though he later tried to recant it, showed intimate knowledge of the crimes. The victims' families attended the trial every day. They sat in the courtroom, forcing themselves to listen to horrific details of how their daughters had suffered, looking directly at the man who had helped kill them. Fernando Garcia, Miriam's father, testified about the impact his daughter's loss had on his family. "She was our light. he said, tears streaming down his face. She had her whole life ahead of her, and this man took it from her for... Why? For pleasure? For fun? On September 23, 1997, the verdict was delivered. Miguel Rickett was found guilty on 3 counts of murder, rape, and kidnapping. He was sentenced to 170 years in prison, the harshest sentences allowed under Spanish law at the time. But under Spanish law, the maximum time anyone can actually serve is 40 years, regardless of sentence. Which meant that Rickett, if he lived long enough, would eventually be released. And Antonio Angles was still free. Chapter 9. The questions that won't go away. From the moment the bodies were found, questions arose about the official investigation. And as years passed, those questions only grew louder, more insistent. First question: how could Antonio Angles, a known criminal whose photograph was being shown on every news channel, board a cargo ship at a port that was supposedly under surveillance? The official explanation that he stowed away has never satisfied many. Ports have security. Cargo ships have crews. How could someone hide for 4 days without being discovered? Did he receive help? And from whom? Second question: why didn't police search more thoroughly in the first hours and days? The La Romana site where the bodies were found was within the initial search area. Volunteers passed near it, but no one checked it carefully until 75 days later. Why? Third question: were more people involved than those who were arrested? Some witnesses reported seeing 4 men in the car that picked up the girls. Not 2. Angles' brother, Enrique, provided an alibi, but some people questioned its validity. Were there other accomplices who were never investigated? Fourth question: was there a cover-up? This is the most controversial question. Some believe that people in positions of power, local politicians, police officers, businessmen, were involved in the murders or helped cover them up. They point to inconsistencies in the investigation, evidence that disappeared, witnesses who weren't properly questioned. Fifth question: what about the snuff films? Rumors persisted for years that the murders had been filmed, that videos of the tortures and rapes existed, that they were being sold on the black market for pornography. Police denied this categorically, but the rumors never completely died. These questions have fueled decades of conspiracy theories, documentaries, investigative books, and public debate, and they've never been satisfactorily answered. The Alcácer girls' case became fertile ground for conspiracy theories ranging from the plausible to the absolutely fantastic. The pornography network theory. This theory suggests that Angles and Rickett didn't act alone, but were part of an organized network that produced child pornography and snuff films. According to this theory, the girls were specifically targeted, the murders were filmed, and powerful people paid for access to these videos. Proponents of this theory point to the organized nature of the crimes, the prolonged time the girls were kept alive, Angles' apparently easy escape, witness testimony claiming to have seen filming equipment in the area, persistent rumors of videos circulating in black markets, the political cover-up theory. This theory argues that local or regional political figures were involved in the murders or in covering them up. It suggests the investigation was deliberately sabotaged to protect powerful people. Evidence cited includes the chaotic and inefficient investigation, Angles' escape, witnesses who claimed to have been threatened to stay quiet, forensic evidence that disappeared, lines of investigation that were closed without explanation, the ritual crime theory. Some more extreme theories suggested the murders were ritual crimes, possibly connected to satanic cults or secret societies. These theories generally cited the specific nature of the tortures and the disposal of the bodies. The official explanation: police and prosecutors maintained it was exactly what it appeared to be. 2 violent criminals who saw an opportunity, kidnapped 3 girls, tortured and raped them for pleasure, and murdered them. No broader conspiracy, no organized network, just opportunistic predators. The debate between these theories continues to this day. Television programs, podcasts, books, documentaries, all explore different angles, presenting new evidence or reinterpreting old evidence. One figure stood out in the investigation of the Alcácer case: investigative journalist Juan Ignacio Blanco. He devoted years of his life to investigating the case, accumulating thousands of pages of documents, interviewing hundreds of witnesses, challenging the official narrative at every point. Blanco believed there was a broader conspiracy. He argued that the police investigation was incompetent at best and criminally negligent at worst. He pointed to dozens of inconsistencies, unfollowed leads, ignored witnesses. His work was controversial. Critics accused him of being a conspiracy theorist, of exploiting tragedy for fame, of giving false hope to the victims' families. Supporters saw him as one of the few willing to ask hard questions, to challenge authorities, to fight for truth. Blanco documented witness testimony from people who claimed to have seen the girls after they were supposedly murdered. He found inconsistencies in the official timeline. He questioned the forensic evidence that linked only Engels and Rickett to the crimes. He wrote books, appeared on television programs, maintained websites dedicated to the case. His investigation profoundly influenced how the Spanish public viewed the case. But he also paid a price. He was sued, threatened, harassed. Some witnesses refused to speak with him out of fear of reprisals. Authorities dismissed him as a nuisance. Juan Ignacio Blanco died in 2013 at the age of 62, never having seen the complete answers he sought. But his work ensured that the Alcácer case would never be forgotten, that the questions would never stop being asked. The Alcácer girls' case fundamentally changed Spanish journalism. The media coverage of the case, particularly in its first months, was so excessive, so exploitative, so damaging that it led to a national rethinking of journalistic ethics. The television programs that had turned tragedy into entertainment faced public backlash. The psychics who had appeared on national television claiming to know where the girls were widely condemned. The journalists who had relentlessly interviewed grieving families were criticized. In response, Spanish media organizations implemented new ethical guidelines, limitations on interviewing victims' families, prohibitions on showing graphic images from crime scenes, restrictions on reporting about minors involved in crimes, greater scrutiny of claims from self-proclaimed experts. The case also led to changes in how police interacted with media. The Guardia Civil was criticized for allowing journalists to compromise the investigation, for sharing too much information too soon, for allowing the case to become a media circus. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on public consciousness. Spaniards who had watched the coverage became more skeptical of media, more aware of how tragedy could be exploited for ratings, more critical of sensationalist journalism. The Alcácer case became shorthand in Spain for everything that can go wrong when media loses sight of its responsibility to victims in pursuit of spectacle. While the nation debated conspiracy theories and media ethics, three families dealt with a loss that could never be adequately expressed. Fernando Garcia, Miriam's father, became the public face of the family's grief. He spoke at press conferences, accepted interviews, became an advocate for victims' rights. But the personal cost was immense. His marriage didn't survive the strain. His health deteriorated. He lived with the weight of knowing exactly how his daughter had suffered in her final hours. Tony's parents, Juan and Maria Gomez, withdrew from public view. They couldn't bear the constant reminder, the cameras, the questions. They tried to rebuild their lives in private to find some path forward. But the loss of their daughter defined them, a grief that never diminished. Desiree's parents, Manuel and Nieves Hernandez, struggled with anger in addition to grief. Anger at the killers, anger at the system that had failed them, anger at the media that had exploited their daughter's death. Manuel became a vocal critic of how the case was handled, demanding answers that never came. All three families had to live in a world where their daughters became national symbols instead of just being their girls, where strangers debated theories about how their daughters died, where the entertainment industry profited from their tragedy, and they had to live knowing that one of the men who killed their daughters, Antonio Engels, never faced justice, that he might be alive somewhere, free, while their girls lay in graves. For more than 2 decades, the search for Antonio Engels continued. Reported sightings came from around the world: Ireland, Portugal, Italy, Brazil, Argentina, even as far as Japan. Every few years, a new sighting would be reported. Someone would see a man who looked like Engels. Police would investigate. Media would report that perhaps, finally, they had found Spain's most wanted fugitive. But every lead turned out to be false. Every sighting was a case of mistaken identity or a deliberate hoax. In 2013, Spanish authorities made a controversial decision. They officially declared Antonio Engels dead. They based this on testimony from crew members of the city of Plymouth, who claimed he had been aboard the ship but had disappeared at some point during the voyage. The official theory is that Engels fell from the ship, either accidentally or by suicide, and drowned in the Irish Sea. His body was never found, but authorities concluded he couldn't have survived. But many reject this conclusion. The victims' families don't believe it. Investigative journalists don't believe it. Even some within law enforcement privately question it, because declaring Engels dead conveniently closes the case. It allows authorities to say that those responsible are either dead or in prison. It allows for closure, regardless of whether that closure is based on truth. In 2019, the Spanish television program, Equipo de Investigación, presented evidence suggesting Engels might be alive and living in Ireland. They showed photographs of a man who bore a striking resemblance to an age-progressed image of Engels. They traced his potential route from Dublin port to a rural Irish community. Spanish police investigated but found no conclusive evidence. The man in the photographs denied being Engels. Without definitive proof, no DNA, no fingerprints, no confession, the case remains unresolved. Antonio Engels officially dead, but possibly maybe alive somewhere. On June 21, 2013, Miguel Riquet was released from prison after serving 19 years of his sentence. Under Spanish law, he had accumulated enough good behavior credits to qualify for early release. News of his release sparked outrage across Spain. The victims' families were devastated. "How can the man who tortured and murdered our daughters walk free?" asked Fernando Garcia at an emotional press conference. "Where is the justice?" Protests erupted in Valencia. Hundreds of people marched demanding that Riquet remain imprisoned. Petitions were signed. Politicians issued statements. But legally, there was nothing to be done. Under existing law, Riquet had served his time. Riquet was released under strict conditions. He was required to register regularly with police. He was prohibited from contact with the victims' families. He had restrictions placed on his movements. He initially moved to Portugal, trying to escape Spanish media attention. But his identity was quickly discovered, and he faced harassment there too. He returned to Spain and reportedly lived somewhere under carefully controlled conditions. In 2018, Riquet gave a rare interview to a Spanish journalist. He expressed remorse for the crimes but continued to insist he had been coerced by Antonio Engels. "I was too afraid to stop him," he claimed. "Engels was a monster. If I had refused to participate, he would have killed me too." Critics point out that in 1992, Riquet was a 32-year-old man, older, larger, and supposedly stronger than the 27-year-old Engels. The claim that he was completely powerless to resist has never been convincing to many. The victims' families rejected his remorse as self-serving and inadequate. "I'm sorry" doesn't bring their daughters back. "I was afraid" doesn't excuse the torture and murder of 3 innocent girls. Miguel Riquet lives. Miriam, Tony, and Desiree do not. Of all the conspiracy theories surrounding the Alcácer case, none has persisted more tenaciously than claims that snuff films were made, videos of the tortures and murders, and sold on black market pornography markets. Police have consistently denied that such videos exist. They've stated they searched exhaustively and found no evidence of filming equipment, videos, or distribution networks, but the rumors have never died. They began almost immediately after the bodies were found and have circulated in one form or another for 3 decades. Some witnesses claimed to have seen filming equipment in the La Romana area around the time of the murders. Others claimed to have seen videos being offered for sale. Some even claimed to have viewed them. Investigative journalists have pursued these leads for years. Some claim to have found evidence of a network that produced and distributed extreme violent pornography, including snuff films. Others dismiss it as urban moral panic, no different from snuff pornography stories that have circulated for decades without verifiable evidence. The challenge is that by their nature, if such videos existed, they would be among the most secretive materials in the criminal world. Those involved in their production or distribution would never admit their existence. Buyers would never come forward, and without an actual video in the hands of authorities, it's impossible to prove or disprove their existence. What's undeniable is that the nature of the murders, the prolonged time the girls were kept alive, the specific and ritual torture, the careful disposal of the bodies, suggests a level of planning and organization beyond simple opportunistic crime. Whether this indicates the existence of actual videos or simply reflects the fantasies of sadistic predators is a question that will likely never be definitively answered. The Alcácer girls' case left scars on Spanish society that remain visible more than 3 decades later. For parents throughout Spain, the case was a terrifying wake-up call. In 1992, it was common for teenagers to hitchhike, to walk home alone at night, to have the kind of freedom that now seems recklessly dangerous. After Alcácer, that innocence vanished. Parents became more protective, more cautious. Children lost freedoms that previous generations had enjoyed. Fear became a constant. Fear of strangers, fear of letting children out of sight, fear that what happened to Miriam, Tony, and Desiree could happen to any child. The case also exposed flaws in the Spanish judicial system. The early release of violent criminals, the limited maximum sentence regardless of how serious the crimes, the apparent ease with which fugitives could evade capture, all these problems were underscored by the Alcácer case. Reforms followed, but never quickly or comprehensively enough to satisfy those who felt the system had failed catastrophically. The case also transformed how Spaniards viewed media. The blatant exploitation of tragedy, the sensationalism, the endless parade of psychics and self-proclaimed experts. All this led a generation to be more skeptical of what they saw on television, more critical of how news was told. And for those in the small town of Alcácer, the impact was particularly profound. Their town, once known only for its citrus fields and quiet rural life, became synonymous with one of the most horrific crimes in Spanish history. Forevermore, they would be the town where the 3 girls died. More than 30 years later, the fundamental questions about the Alcácer case remain unanswered. Is Antonio Angles alive or dead? If alive, where is he? How did he manage to evade capture for so long? Did he receive help? And from whom? Did Miguel Riquet tell the truth about his level of participation? Was he really coerced by Angles, or was he an equal participant? Was his confession complete and accurate, or was he protecting others? Were more people involved besides Angles and Riquet? What about the witnesses who reported seeing 4 men in the car? What about Angles' brother, whose alibi was never thoroughly verified? Was the investigation incompetent, or was there a deliberate cover-up? Why were so many leads not followed? Why did evidence disappear? Why were witnesses ignored? Were snuff films made? Was this part of an organized network of violent pornography? Or were they simply opportunistic criminals who saw 3 vulnerable girls and acted on their predatory impulses? Every question leads to more questions. Every answer raises new doubts. And after 3 decades, the truth seems more elusive than ever. What is known with certainty is limited. 3 innocent girls were kidnapped, tortured, and murdered. Miguel Riquet was convicted and served time, though many feel it wasn't enough. Antonio Angles escaped justice, either because he's dead or because he managed to flee and hide. The investigation was deeply flawed, allowing evidence to be lost and leads to go cold. Media exploited the tragedy in ways that changed Spanish journalism. The families never received complete justice or closure. Beyond these basic facts, almost everything is debatable, questionable, uncertain. It's important, amid all the conspiracy theories and debate about media ethics and police competence, to remember who Miriam Garcia, Tony Gomez, and Desiree Hernandez really were. They weren't just victims. They weren't just a famous case. They were real girls with real lives, with families who loved them, with dreams about their futures. Miriam was 14 years old. She loved to dance. She wanted to be a hairdresser. She was known for her laughter, her kindness, how she always included everyone. Her friends remembered her as the one who kept the group together, the one who made everyone feel welcome. Toni was also 14 years old. She was quiet, thoughtful, loved to read. She dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world beyond her small town. Her teachers remembered her as a diligent student who always did her work, who treated everyone with respect. Desiree was 15 years old. She was the leader of the group, the confident one, the one who planned their adventures. She wanted to study medicine to help people. Her family remembered her as brave, determined, someone who knew what she wanted and pursued her goals. They were three normal girls from a normal small town. Their crime was wanting to go dancing on a Friday night. Their mistake was trusting the wrong people. They deserved long lives filled with love, laughter, achievements. They deserved to grow up, go to college, fall in love, have careers, maybe their own families. They deserved all the ordinary experiences that make up a well-lived life. Instead, their lives were brutally cut short at 14 and 15 years old, and their deaths became a national spectacle. Their suffering exploited for ratings, their names forever associated with one of Spain's most notorious crimes. But those who knew them refused to let them be defined only by how they died. They insist on remembering how they lived, as bright, loving girls with all the potential in the world. As we reach the end of this story, I need you to understand something. There's no real closure here. No neat resolution. Just questions, grief, and the weight of injustice. Antonio Angles, alive or dead, never faced trial. Miguel Riquet served less than 20 years for helping to torture and murder three girls. The families never got the answers they deserved. And the complete truth, what really happened that night, who else might have been involved, whether there was a broader conspiracy, remains buried under layers of incompetence, possible corruption, and decades of speculation. The Alcácer girls' case stands as a reminder of how systems can fail, of how tragedy can be exploited, of how justice sometimes simply doesn't arrive. But it also stands as a reminder of why these stories must be told. Not for entertainment, not for sensationalism, but to remember, to honor, to ensure that Miriam, Toni, and Desiree are not forgotten. As you prepare for sleep tonight, listening to the rain, think about three girls who just wanted to dance. Think about how it should have been an ordinary night, music, laughter, the simple joy of being young. Think about their families, who have lived for more than 30 years with grief that never diminishes, with questions that have never been answered, with justice that was never fully served. Think about how fragile safety is, how quickly joy can continue 47 aim turned to tragedy, how important it is that the institutions designed to protect the vulnerable actually do their job. The small town of Alcácer has a memorial for the three girls. On the anniversary of their disappearance each year, people still come to leave flowers, to remember, to ensure they're never forgotten. Because that's what we can do. When justice fails, when answers remain elusive, when the system falls short, we can remember, we can honor, we can say their names. Miriam Garcia, Toni Gomez, Desiree Hernandez, three girls who deserved better, three lives that mattered, three futures stolen by inconceivable violence. Rest in peace, girls. Your story has been told with the respect it deserves. And though complete justice may never come, you will never be forgotten. If you're new here, welcome to our channel. We specialize in true crime stories told in a calming voice, accompanied by gentle rain, sounds to help you drift off to sleep. If you enjoy tonight's mystery, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting that notification bell so you never miss a story. And if you're feeling generous, a like on this video helps us tremendously. It tells YouTube to share our content with others who might enjoy it. Feel free to share this with anyone who loves true crime or needs help falling asleep. What time is it where you are? Leave a comment and let me know. There's something comforting about knowing we're all here together, scattered across time zones, but united by our fascination with the unexplained. Now settle in. Get comfortable. Tonight, we're traveling back to December 1919, to the snow-covered streets of Toronto, Canada. This is the story of a man who vanished into thin air on the night of his greatest triumph. a millionaire theater owner who stepped out of his office and was never seen again. Despite one of the most extensive investigations in Canadian history, despite countless theories and suspects, despite a fortune waiting to be claimed, Ambrose Small simply ceased to exist. And the question that has haunted investigators for over a century remains: what happened to Ambrose Small? The snow fell thick and heavy over Toronto on the evening of December 2nd, 1919. It was the kind of snow that muffled sound, that transformed the city into something quieter, more secretive. The streets glistened under the gas lamps, and in the theater district, the marquees blazed with promise. Ambrose Small should have been celebrating. After all, he had just completed the business transaction of his lifetime, the sale of his theater empire for $1.7 million, an astronomical sum in 1919. That's equivalent to roughly $27 million today. He was 56 years old, wealthy beyond measure, and finally free from the daily grind of managing his theatrical holdings across Canada. But those who saw him that day would later remember something troubling in his demeanor. He seemed distracted, perhaps even anxious, though he tried to hide it behind his usual brusque manner. What was weighing on his mind as he walked through his Grand Opera House that afternoon? He had meetings to attend, papers to sign, details to finalize. The sale to the TransCanada Theatre Company had been agreed upon, but there were still loose ends. Money to be transferred, counts to be settled. Ambrose Small was nothing if not meticulous about money. Some would say obsessed with it. He had not become one of the richest men in Toronto by being careless. That afternoon, he had lunch at the Grand Opera House with his lawyer, E.W.M. Flock. They discussed the details of the sale. Small seemed satisfied, even pleased. After lunch, they walked together to the Dominion Bank, where Small deposited a check for $100,000, just a portion of his vast new fortune. The bank manager watched as Small endorsed the check with his distinctive signature, never imagining it would be one of the last times anyone saw Ambrose Small conduct business. But something happened after that bank visit. Something that would change everything. Because when Small returned to his office at the Grand Opera House, he made a decision that would puzzle investigators for decades. What did he do in those final hours before he vanished? To understand what happened to Ambrose Small, you must first understand who he was. And Ambrose Small was not a man who inspired lukewarm feelings. People either admired his business acumen or despised his ruthlessness. There was no middle ground. Born in 1863 to a middle-class family in Bradford, Ontario, Ambrose showed an early aptitude for business. But it was in the theater industry that he found his calling. By the 1890s, he was acquiring theaters across Ontario, building an empire that would eventually span the entire country. He owned the Grand Opera House in Toronto, the Grand Theatre in London, theaters in Hamilton, Kingston, Peterborough, and beyond. He was known as a hard bargainer, someone who squeezed every penny from his investments. His theaters were profitable, but not because he was generous. Performers complained about his low wages. Employees whispered about his temper. He had a reputation for being difficult, demanding, and utterly uncompromising. His marriage to Teresa Corman in 1902 had been seen by Toronto society as something of a surprise. Teresa came from a wealthy Catholic family, well-educated and cultured. She was everything Ambrose was not: refined, devout, patient. Why she married him remained a topic of speculation in Toronto's drawing rooms. Some said it was for family business connections. Others suggested that Teresa saw something in Ambrose that others missed, some hidden depth beneath his harsh exterior. But by 1919, the marriage had grown cold. They lived together in their mansion at 103 Glen Road in Rosedale, Toronto's most prestigious neighborhood, but they lived separate lives. Ambrose was rarely home. He spent his evenings at his theaters, his nights at his private clubs, often in the company of women who were not his wife. And then there was his secretary, John Dowdy, a quiet, efficient man who had worked for Small for years, handling the endless details of the theater business. Dowdy knew everything about Small's affairs, business and otherwise. He knew where the money went, who owed Small money, and who Small owed. He was privy to secrets that others could only guess at. On that December evening in 1919, Doughty was still at the Grand Opera House. He would be one of the last people to see Ambrose Small alive. But what passed between them in those final hours would become the subject of intense scrutiny. Because by the next morning, both men would be gone from Toronto, and only one would ever return. After returning from the bank at approximately 3:30 p.m., Ambrose Small entered his office on the ground floor of the Grand Opera House. The building was bustling with the usual afternoon activity. Stagehands preparing for the evening performance, box office clerks counting receipts, actors arriving for makeup calls. Small's office was located just off the main lobby, a modest room that belied his wealth. Unlike many successful men of his era, Small did not believe in ostentatious displays. His desk was practical, his furnishings functional. What mattered to him was what the ledger said, not how the office looked. John Doughty followed him into the office. They had business to discuss, always more business. Small's secretary was a man of about 35, thin and nervous in manner, with spectacles that he constantly adjusted. He had been with Small long enough to anticipate his moods, to know when to speak and when to remain silent. What they discussed in that office has never been fully established. Later, Doughty would tell investigators that they reviewed various financial matters related to the sale. There were bonds to be transferred, accounts to be reconciled. It was routine work, or so Doughty claimed. But there was something else happening that afternoon, something that wouldn't come to light immediately. Small received a telephone call around 5 p.m. Who was on the other end of that call? Doughty said he didn't know. Small took the call privately, asking his secretary to step out of the office. When Doughty returned a few minutes later, Small seemed agitated. He was pacing, something he did when troubled. Shortly after 5:30 p.m., Ambrose Small put on his overcoat and hat. He told Doughty he was going to the Grand Theatre on Adelaide Street, another of his properties, to check on something. Doughty offered to accompany him, but Small declined. He said he would return within the hour. The stage doorman, a man named Thomas Small, no relation, watched as Ambrose Small walked out into the snowy evening. He turned west on Adelaide Street and disappeared into the crowds of shoppers and theatergoers heading home for dinner. Thomas Small was certain of what he saw, because he checked his watch. It was 5:45 p.m. exactly. He had no reason to believe it was significant at the time. After all, Ambrose Small came and went from his theaters at all hours. There was nothing unusual about it. Except that this time, Ambrose Small never came back. And when investigators tried to trace his movements after he left that door, they discovered something that would deepen the mystery immeasurably. Several witnesses claimed to have seen Small that evening, but their accounts contradicted each other in ways that made no sense. Where did Ambrose Small go after leaving the Grand Opera House? Teresa Small was not immediately concerned when her husband didn't come home that night. This was not unusual behavior for Ambrose. He often stayed late at one of his theaters or spent the night at his club. Their marriage had evolved into an arrangement of mutual tolerance. She managed the household and her social obligations. He managed his business and his diversions. They had learned not to question each other too closely. But when December 3rd arrived and there was still no word from Ambrose, Teresa began to feel the first stirrings of unease. She telephoned the Grand Opera House. John Doughty answered. No, he told her Mr. Small had not been in that morning. He had left the previous evening around 5:45 and hadn't returned. Did he say where he was going? Teresa asked. Doughty hesitated. He said he was going to check on something at the Grand Theatre, but I don't know if he actually went there. The Grand Theatre. Teresa called there next. No, the manager told her Mr. Small had not been there the previous evening. No one had seen him. Now the unease blossomed into something sharper. Teresa Small was a pragmatic woman, not given to panic or dramatics, but she knew her husband's habits. Even when he was conducting his various affairs, even when he was gambling at his clubs, he always checked in eventually. He was compulsive about his businesses, about knowing what was happening at each of his theaters. For him to simply vanish without a word to anyone was unthinkable. She called his lawyer E.W.M. Flock. Had he heard from Ambrose? No, Flock said, not since their lunch the previous day. He sounded puzzled. They had just completed a massive sale. Surely Small would want to follow up on the details. Teresa spent December 3rd making calls, checking with anyone who might have seen or heard from her husband, his club, his business associates, the managers of his various theaters. No one had seen him. No one had heard from him. It was as if Ambrose Small had stepped out of the Grand Opera House and stepped out of existence. On the morning of December 4th, Teresa Small did something she would never have done under normal circumstances. She went to the police. Detective Inspector George Kennedy of the Toronto Police received her in his office at City Hall. He listened as she described her husband's disappearance, making notes in his careful hand. When she finished, he looked up at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Mrs. Small," he said slowly, "I need to ask you something directly. Is it possible your husband simply left? That he decided to start a new life somewhere else?" Teresa stiffened. "Without his fortune? Without access to his bank accounts? Inspector, my husband just sold his business for $1.7 million. Why would he walk away from that?" It was a fair question. And it was that question that would transform Ambrose Small's disappearance from a missing person case into something far more sinister. Because as Inspector Kennedy began his investigation, he would discover that the money from the sale had never been properly deposited. And John Dowdy, the loyal secretary who knew all of Small's secrets, had also disappeared. Inspector Kennedy was a methodical man, respected throughout the Toronto Police for his thoroughness. He had solved numerous cases through patient investigation and attention to detail. But even he had to admit that the disappearance of Ambrose Small presented unusual challenges from the very beginning. His first action was to visit the Grand Opera House. He interviewed the staff, starting with the stage doorman who had seen Small leave on the evening of December 2nd. The man was certain of the time, 5:45 p.m., and certain of the direction Small had walked, west on Adelaide Street. Kennedy then asked to speak with John Dowdy. That's when he learned something that immediately elevated his concern. Dowdy had not been seen since December 2nd either. He had left the Grand Opera House shortly after Small, telling another employee he was going home. But when Kennedy sent officers to Dowdy's boarding house, the landlady reported that Dowdy had packed a bag and left on December 3rd, saying he was going to visit family. "Did he say which family?" Kennedy asked. "No," the landlady replied, "and I didn't ask. He paid his rent through the month, so I had no reason to question him." This was troubling, very troubling. Kennedy returned to the Grand Opera House and requested access to Small's office and files. What he found there would transform the investigation into something far more complex. The financial records were in disarray. Papers were missing. And most significantly, when Kennedy examined the books related to the theater sale, he discovered significant discrepancies. The sale had been for $1.7 million. Of that, $1 million had been in the form of a check which Small had deposited, or at least part of which he had deposited, on December 2nd. But the bonds that made up the remainder of the sale were missing. Bonds worth $700,000, negotiable and as good as cash if one knew how to handle them properly. John Dowdy, as Small's secretary, would have known exactly how to handle them. Kennedy sat in Small's office, staring at the empty spaces in the filing cabinets, and felt a cold certainty settle over him. This was not a simple disappearance. This was either a theft that had somehow gone terribly wrong or something far worse. But which was it? Had Dowdy stolen the bonds and fled, possibly killing Small to prevent discovery? Or had Small orchestrated his own disappearance, planning to blame Dowdy for the missing money? Or was there a third possibility, something Kennedy hadn't yet considered? He needed to find John Dowdy. That much was clear. Kennedy issued a bulletin to police departments across Canada and the United States. John Dowdy, age 35, thin build, wears spectacles, wanted for questioning in connection with the disappearance of Ambrose Small and the theft of negotiable bonds worth $700,000. The manhunt had begun. But what Kennedy didn't yet know was that finding Dowdy would only deepen the mystery, not solve it. because when they finally tracked him down, Dowdy would tell a story that explained everything and nothing, that answered questions while raising even more troubling ones. Within days of Teresa Small's report, the disappearance of Ambrose Small became front-page news across Canada. The Toronto newspapers ran sensational headlines: "Millionaire theater owner vanishes. Secretary flees with fortune." The story had everything the public craved: wealth, mystery, possible betrayal, and the tantalizing question of whether a prominent man could simply disappear without a trace. Inspector Kennedy assembled a team of detectives and began a systematic investigation. They retraced Small's movements on December 2nd with meticulous care. The lunch with lawyer E.W.M. Flock, confirmed. The visit to the Dominion Bank to deposit the check, confirmed. The return to the Grand Opera House around 3:30 p.m., confirmed. The departure at 5:45 p.m., confirmed by the stage doorman. But after that, the trail became confused. A shopkeeper on Adelaide Street claimed to have seen Small walking west around 6 p.m. A cab driver reported picking up a man matching Small's description near the Grand Theatre around 6:30 p.m. and dropping him at Union Station. But the station master at Union Station had no record of Small purchasing a ticket, and none of the railway porters remembered seeing him. Other witnesses came forward with conflicting accounts. A woman claimed to have seen Small entering a restaurant on King Street around 7 p.m. A man insisted he'd seen Small getting into an automobile with two other men near the waterfront. Each lead was investigated. Each lead went nowhere. Kennedy expanded the search to Small's personal life. He interviewed Teresa Small again, this time asking more probing questions about her husband's habits, his associates, his enemies. Teresa was remarkably forthcoming, displaying none of the defensiveness one might expect from a wife whose husband's infidelities were about to become public knowledge. "Inspector," she said during one interview, "I'm not naive about my husband's character. He was not an easy man to live with. He had affairs, I knew about them. He gambled, I knew about that too. He had business rivals who disliked him intensely, but he was not a man who would abandon his fortune. Money was everything to Ambrose. Everything. So if he's missing, it's not by choice." "Can you think of anyone who might have wanted to harm him?" Kennedy asked. Teresa considered this carefully. "Inspector, my husband drove hard bargains. He foreclosed on people who couldn't pay their debts. He evicted tenants. He fired employees without much ceremony. In business, he made many enemies." "But murderous enemies? I honestly don't know." Kennedy's team began compiling a list of people who might have had grievances against Small. The list grew disturbingly long. Former business partners who felt cheated, theater managers he'd fired, actors he'd blacklisted, landlords whose properties he'd acquired through foreclosure. Some of these people had made threats against Small, according to witnesses, but threats were one thing, following through was another. Meanwhile, the search for John Dowdy continued. Kennedy had officers checking train stations, interviewing ticket agents, showing Dowdy's photograph. The secretary had vanished as completely as his employer. But unlike Small, Dowdy had left traces. He had withdrawn money from his bank account on December 3rd, a significant sum of $2,000. He had told his landlady he was leaving. He had been seen boarding a train at Union Station heading west. On December 10th, Kennedy received a telegram that made his pulse quicken. Police in Detroit had detained a man matching Dowdy's description. Kennedy immediately arranged to travel to Detroit. Could this be the break he needed? Would Dowdy's capture finally solve the mystery of what happened to Ambrose Small? The man sitting in the Detroit police interrogation room looked exhausted and frightened. John Dowdy had been arrested at a boarding house in Detroit's downtown district, recognized by an alert landlady who had seen his photograph in the newspaper. He had offered no resistance when the police came for him. Inspector Kennedy entered the room and sat down across from Dowdy. For a long moment, the two men simply looked at each other. Dowdy was the first to speak. "I didn't kill him," he said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "I swear to you, Inspector, I didn't kill Ambrose Small." "Then why did you run?" Kennedy asked calmly. Dowdy removed his spectacles and rubbed his eyes. Because I knew how it would look. The bonds are missing. Mr. Small is missing. And I'm his secretary. I had access to everything. Who would believe me? Why don't you tell me what happened? Kennedy suggested. Start from the beginning.